Well, I was 18 years old and a senior in high school on September 11th, 2001. And as Rob mentioned, I do remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. I remember the months following the attacks, there was a sense of clarity and a sense of certainty in our resolve to come together united as one people to overcome the threat of terrorism. There's also a strong sense of insecurity and uncertainty that was in the air as well, because none of us knew exactly what the long-term effects of the attacks might be. How might they shape us? How might they change the way we think? How might they change the way we see the world? On the 15th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, our country has undergone a lot of change since then. And with 15 years in the rearview mirror, we have the opportunity to kind of look back and see what has changed. And are they good changes? We're going to read a text today, and we did not intentionally pick this text for September 11th. In fact, I kind of wish it was on a different day. We broke the text down into little segments and tagged them beside dates, so it wasn't until about a month ago that I realized that I would be preaching this text on September 11th. What Jesus says here has massive implications for us as we sort through some of the effects of it still to this day. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're in Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. Here's what it says. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Which is a question that we've heard people ask Jesus before. He said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said to him, good answer. That's the right one, right? That's the right answer. Do this and you'll live. But the man, wanting to justify himself, asked Jesus this question, and who is my neighbor? So I just kind of pictured Jesus, he's answered the question, turns to the side, and you have a question? He's like, wait. Who's my neighbor? And so that's the context for this story that Jesus will tell this parable. He says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. We've got a picture of this hill country. If you even throw that picture up real fast. This is like absolutely desolate country. And it is radical descent as well. It's a 3,000-foot drop from Jerusalem to Jericho. So when it says down, that's what's happening. It's not a really safe journey there. Which is indicated by the fact that he then fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So, likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. It doesn't tell us why, it doesn't give us, the reasons, he just passed by. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I'll repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Jesus posed this question back to the expert in law, and he says, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. So, this expert in the law is not like a lawyer that we would have who's an expert in like the United States law. This is an expert in the Mosaic law, somebody who's spent their whole life studying what does it mean for us as a nation of Israelites to follow this law. He's an expert in the law. So when Jesus asks, him the question, well, what do you think? What do you say? He has a really good answer for it, right? He's like, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's, in fact, what Jesus himself said all of it boiled down to when somebody asked him. He answered the question the same way. And Jesus is like, great answer. You do that and you'll live. But he wasn't satisfied with it. He wanted something more. He wanted to know, but who is my neighbor? What is the boundary of this love? Who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells this story. And you have a few characters. You have the guy who's walking on that road, that dangerous road. He's mugged, stripped naked, left there for dead. And then you have a priest, a guy who does the service of God in the temple. And he walks by, he sees him, he crosses the other side of the road. We can make some assumptions as to why he did that for ceremonial cleanliness and stuff like that. But Jesus doesn't get into that. He just says he went to the other side of the road and he passed by. Well, then there's a Levite. This is a guy who's also an Israelite. And he helped perform some of the things in the temple with priests, kind of assistants. They're God-given roles. And Jesus says he walked over to the other side of the road and he passed by as well. Why? I don't know, but he did. And so the expert in the law is probably anticipating that Jesus is going to bring in a third character who is kind of like a Israelite with no social status. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus brings along a Samaritan, which may mean nothing to you. But the audience is not expecting this. The expert in the law is not expecting this at all. Because here's what a Samaritan is. A Samaritan, well, in order to understand it, we've got to go back a couple thousand years to a guy named Jacob. Jacob will play a huge part in the unfolding story of God. God will later change his name to Israel, and his sons will form the 12 tribes of Israel that you may have heard about. Jacob was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. So Jacob's the great-grandson of Abraham. And God had set apart Abraham with this promise that Rob mentioned earlier. Through this family, I'm going to bless all the peoples of the earth. And the fulfillment of that promise is the whole story arc of the Old Testament. That's what's happening in the Old Testament, is the continuation of that promise, seeing that promise through. So Jacob's sons are a continuation of that promise coming true. But as the descendants of these 12 sons reproduce and multiply, they're temporarily united as one nation, but real quickly divided. After their third king, Solomon, dies, his son takes over, and 10 out of the 12 tribes reject him. They say, well, we don't want to follow this guy. We're going to revolt and make our own kingdom. And so there's two kingdoms that are established, northern kingdom and southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel with its capital Samaria. The southern kingdom called Judah with its capital being Jerusalem. The southern kingdom believed that the northern kingdom of Israel was a sinful kingdom and was divinely punished for its idolatry and sin by being destroyed by the Assyrians in 720 BC. Assyria just comes in and takes over and then basically scatters them abroad. That's what we have in the Old Testament. We read that story. But the Samaritans, by the time that Jesus came on the scene, had rejected that. They said that's not a right characterization of who we are. And they claimed that they were the descendants of the 10 lost tribes and that they were actually the rightful heirs of the promise of Abraham. They claimed that their place of worship was the correct place of worship, Mount Gerizim, and that their Pentateuch, their version of the Pentateuch, was the correct one, and that the Israelites had falsified their text. So these tensions were real palpable. Both Jewish and Samaritan religious leaders taught that it was wrong to have contact with the opposite group. And neither were really allowed. It wasn't that they weren't allowed, but they were not encouraged to enter each other's territories or even speak to one another. There was a deep disdain between them. So you can imagine how the expert in the law would have been offended by this. You have a foreigner who is a part of a religious group that loves his neighbor more than a pious and religious Jew, priest, and more than a pious and religious Levite. Now, this parable is brilliant because it does two things at once, which both serve to really nail home Jesus' point emphatically. The first thing is it highlights a selfless act of unexpected love. So the man that ends up stopping is a Samaritan, right? Well, the bad blood flows both ways. It's not that just Jews can't stand Samaritans. Samaritans also can't stand Jews. So the two Jews that passed by on the road, and assumably, I don't know if that's a word, but presumably, the guy that's been beaten is an Israelite. the two guys pass on the side of the road. Well, the Samaritan, who has this disdain for Jewish people kind of built into him, he does stop. He does love this man as his neighbor. He didn't have to do anything about it, but he demonstrated love to him with no regard for his own personal safety, with no regard for what it would cost him financially, and no regard for the physical labor of actually picking up a half-dead guy and taking him to an inn, right? So he highlights a selfless act of unexpected love. And second, Jesus highlights the hatred of Samaritans in this guy's heart through the story. So in essence, Jesus is replying to this man's question in this way: the man you hate is your neighbor. Notice how Jesus tells the story. He says there's a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And Jesus asks him after the story, which one of them was a good neighbor? The guy can't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. He's a real passive answer. He's like, yeah, the one who showed him mercy. He won't even say Samaritan. There's a deep disdain that he has for him. So he's highlighting this hatred in the expert of the law's heart. And there's a lot that goes into that. I actually mentioned a lot of it in the first service, and then I went way over. So I cut a lot of it. So if you want to trust me on that, that's fine too. And I thought about doing a little podcast maybe this week to talk about some of that so you can get filled in. But this is the point where it becomes quite difficult for us to swallow, because in order for us to really grasp the magnitude and the raw power of this story, we need to experience it for ourselves. Because when you hear the story, when I hear the story in America in 2016, it does nothing. I'm like, yeah, okay, there's Samaritan, that's fine. I don't know anything about Samaritans. I don't know any Samaritans. I'm not offended by Samaritans. But there is a pointed way of retelling this story in our modern context that is offensive. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to extend some grace to me as I do it. Here's how you retell this parable in modern context, I believe. You replace the priest with a pastor. You replace the Levite with a Christian who's really involved in a church. And you replace the Samaritan with a Muslim. The relationship between Christians and Muslims today parallels the racial and religious tensions between Jews and Samaritans in the Old Testament. You say, what do you mean? Well, I'll tell you. Both Samaritans and Jews were monotheists. Both Jews and Samaritans claimed to worship the God of Abraham. Both Jews and Samaritans claimed that they were the rightful heirs of the promise God gave to Abraham. Both Jews and Samaritans looked forward to a day when the Messiah would bring about universal peace, but not through the same lineage. And this is really important. See, the way that they divided, if you remember, was that the 10 tribes revolted against Rehoboam. And you're like, well, who cares? Well, the reason that's important is that Rehoboam is from a certain line from Jacob, from the tribe of Judah. And Jacob prays over Judah back in the day in Genesis 49, and he says, through you, there's going to be a king that comes, and that king will receive the scepter, and it belongs to him, and he will rule over the nations. So this is the promise of the Messiah, this coming through the line of Judah. Well, King David was of the line of Judah. King Solomon was of the line of Judah, and then King Rehoboam, Solomon's son, was from the line of Judah. When the 10 tribes revolt against Rehoboam, they revolt against God's plan for bringing about the redemption of the world. And they're stuck thinking they have a Messiah that's coming. But it's not going to come through the way that God said it was going to come. They rejected the idea that the promised Messiah was coming through the line of Judah. Christians and Muslims are monotheists. Both claim to worship the God of Abraham. Both look forward to a future day of universal peace brought through a Messiah. And each claim that they're the rightful heirs of the promise to Abraham. Well, how is that so? Well, because I mentioned that Jacob was the son of Isaac. Isaac was the son of Abraham, but not the firstborn son of Abraham. The firstborn son of Abraham, although inappropriately so, was Ishmael. Muslims claim that they're spiritual and even physical descendants of Ishmael. Jews and Samaritans had an extensive history of wars and assaults. You can read about some of those in the Old Testament, and then some of them in history books. Josephus, which we talked a little bit about last week. For more than 1,400 years now, tensions between Christians and Muslims have been high. 1,400 years. And even today, the tension between the sons of Abraham is playing out before our eyes. It is still the central conflict of our world. I think this is really interesting, right? The fact that Abraham would not believe the promise that God had given him, he had to take things into his own hands. If you know that story, you might not. He ends up sleeping with someone that's not his wife so that he can bring about this promised son. Well, brings about Ishmael. And so now you have two parallel families kind of running out from Abraham, both of which are claiming that they are the rightful descendants and that they are the bearers of the promise, that they will be the ones through which everything is reconciled and restored, and there will be universal flourishing and blessing. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor, and we say, who is my neighbor? I think specifically for us, especially in the way that things have progressed in the last 15 years, I think Jesus would say, the Muslim is your neighbor. Because there's a real deep disdain among Christians for Muslims. I want to make a clear distinction here. Muslims and Islamic extremists are two different groups. Muslims live here among us. They live in Bellbrook, Centerville, Dayton, Springboro. I have not met one in Waynesville, not yet. But they're normal people like you and I, and they are quite literally our neighbors. And yes, they worship a different God. But we need to demonstrate the same redeeming love that we've experienced to them. We must allow the narrative of the kingdom of God to determine how we interact with them, not the narrative that we gain from our family history, not the narrative that we've gained from our dinner tables, not the narrative that we've gained from watching 24-hour news networks. The kingdom narrative is different. It says that all people have value because they're made in God's image. And it says that all people, even Muslims, should have the opportunity to see and hear about the transforming power of the gospel. We must be very careful not to exclude them from our love. We must not battle them as enemies, because if we do that, we basically guarantee that they never really experience the power of the gospel. On the other hand, you have Islamic extremists like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and the Taliban, which have carried out despicable acts of terror throughout the world against Americans, against Europeans, against Africans, against Arabs, and they must be brought to justice. According to Paul in Romans 13, God has ordained government as the instrument to execute his wrath on injustice. So it is, in fact, the God-given responsibility of governments to bring them to justice. But we are not the government. We are the church. And the responsibility that we have is different. We have a different role. Paul says right before that in Romans 12, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it's written, 'Vengeance is mine. I'll repay,' says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you'll be heaping burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Some of you are sitting here saying, "I can't believe he's suggesting this. I can't believe what he's talking about here. How could he say such a thing?" And that's precisely the reaction that Jesus wanted to get out of the expert of the law as he told this story. Even these Islamic extremist groups are not exempt from our love. What would it look like to demonstrate love to a group like ISIS, for instance? Well, ISIS released a video last year showing the execution of 21 Christians in Egypt. It was entitled, this is what they titled it on the internet, "A Message Signed with Blood to the Nation of the Cross." That's you, and that's me. And they must be brought to justice. We must be very careful not to exclude them from our love. To a group like ISIS, especially in the way that things have progressed in the last 15 years, I think Jesus would say, the Muslim is your neighbor. Well, a young filmmaker in Los Angeles penned a response to that video entitled "A Letter from the People of the Cross to ISIS." We're going to watch that now. Miroslav Volf, who is a professor of theology at Yale Divinity School, was born in Croatia, and he grew up in communist Yugoslavia, where he witnessed incredible ethnic tension between the Croatians and the Serbians. After the fall of communism in 1991, those tensions escalated into a bloody war. On the morning of 9/11, he was speaking at an annual international prayer breakfast at the United Nations, just blocks away while the terrorist attacks happened. And his topic that he was speaking on that morning was reconciling with our enemies. Specifically with this message: forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners. But no one can be in the presence of God, of the crucified Messiah, for long without overcoming this double exclusion, without transposing the enemy from the sphere of the monstrous into the sphere of shared humanity, and herself from the sphere of proud innocence into the sphere of common sinfulness. When one knows, as the cross demonstrates, that the torture will not eternally triumph over the victim, one is free to rediscover that person's humanity and imitate God's love for him. And when one knows, as the cross demonstrates, that God's love is greater than all sin, one is free to see oneself in the light of God's justice and so rediscover one's own sinfulness. After the speech, because he hadn't found out what was happening, he was asked, "Do you still believe that? What do you say now?" And he said, "There is no imaginable deed that should take a person outside of our will to embrace him, because there is no imaginable deed that can take a person out of God's will to embrace them," which is what I think is inscribed in big letters in the narrative of the cross of Christ. What in the world is he talking about? It's love. You maybe heard that. Yeah, Christianity's about love, and they'll know we are Christians by our love. What in the world does that mean? Well, it's not a weak, fragile, undetermined kind of love. It's not the kind of love that we hear about in songs on the radio. This is the kind of world-shaking, life-altering, strong as iron, pure as water kind of love that does not waver in the face of opposition. It is unconditional. It is unpenetratable. It is unparalleled. It is raw and dynamic. It doesn't stop. It keeps coming after us. It's irresistible to those that experience it. It's unfathomable to those who see it. It doesn't stop. And it's displayed as Jesus hangs on the cross. When the Romans, members of a terrifying conquest-oriented empire that worshiped their emperor as God, are beating, mocking, and crucifying Jesus, his love is looking down on them and saying, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." His love knows no boundaries. And this expert in the law wants to know, yeah, but what's the boundary, Jesus? Where's the line? Where do I draw the line? Who is my neighbor? And Jesus says, there are no boundaries. Lucky for us. And so as his sons and daughters, the love that we are called to demonstrate to the world knows no boundaries. It transcends all boundaries. Everything that we're being told has to be a boundary. Jesus breaks through it. Says that's not a boundary. It will not stop my love. Why? Because apart from him, apart from his blood, we're all the same. The blood of Jesus is the enduring symbol of grace undeserved. It's the enduring promise of forgiveness, even for the worst of sinners. It's the enduring symbol of hope for a lost and desperate and hopeless world that it seems like it's breaking apart at its very seams before us. It is at the cross where the worst parts of our humanity are exposed and forgiven. It's at the cross where we admit we're guilty and yet still loved. It is that blood that is poured out, a demonstration of love that gives us our identity, that enables us to love like we never imagined we could love, to love in a way that no one else understands, to love in a way that just doesn't make sense.